And we're back for episode 3 of part 2 of the Amsterdam Torture Museum. We left off with this object on display, the cage. Just gaze at it for a moment, or absorb its significance, and create some suspense, because I'm not going to provide any more details at this point. I would rather foreshadow. And there you go, the human cage. We're going to leap ahead to another item on display. I know a lot of people in the audience here will probably recognize this from their heavy metal days. This is the Iron Maiden. Let's look at some text and then return to this image. The Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. According to legend, this was a horrific executing machine hidden in the darkest dungeon of a medieval castle. Now, what the Iron Maiden is supposedly used was an instrument of torture, not necessarily of execution. But let's go back to the Iron Maiden on display. Apparently this is the real deal. Once again, visiting these exhibits and these museums, authenticity is one of the driving objects or objectives of the prison experience. The audience, the visitors, the tourists want to be convinced that what they see is something that is real, even if it's something from the past. Authenticity. Now, the victim would be placed inside this Iron Maiden. What you can't really see, and I'm drawing a bit of an imaginary line with the cursor, there's a separation of these two panels that will open up. And once these panels are open, the victim would be placed inside this large wooden frame. Then the panels would be closed. And the torturer would systematically walk around the instrument, and there are many holes to which he could insert a needle-like spike that would pierce the body of the victim. And then he could remove that pointed instrument and then walk to another location of the Iron Maiden. So maybe he then goes into the shoulder and then removes that instrument, and then goes to the back of the leg elsewhere, and then he might very well leave it there. Meanwhile, the victim screams in agony. The Iron Maiden. Here's an illustration of what that Iron Maiden might look like in medieval times. Remember the cages? We're back. The everlasting remembrance as an eternal example for certain criminals. The judges did not consider the highest gallows high enough. Infamous gang leaders were hanged from city towers, and highwaymen coffins at intersections, a combination of gallows and cages of public disgrace in Central Europe. The victims of this humiliating sentence were mostly Jews. Often Jewish citizens were picked at random to be hanged by the arms and feet, besmirched with pitch, or beset by wild dogs. Only conversion to Christianity could shorten the suffering. So this is very similar to what we would call a form of lynching, or which they would identify certain people, namely Jews, place them in these cages, hoist them up for public display, the spectacle. Many passageways into medieval cities, such as London. London Bridge was oftentimes known for having these hanging cages, or victims, or bodies of victims who were accused of being outlaws and bandits and so on and so forth. But let's look at some of the evidence here. Now this is an illustration which provides some evidence as to how this was used, but for authenticity, you want to gaze at the real deal. This item's on display in the Torture Museum. A rather convincing narrative about its significance. But let's take a look at this other panel. Down here, colorization, boutique lighting, drawing our attention away from the cage to another item situated nearby. What is this seemingly benign device? A metal frame. What is the significance of this metal frame? Let's go to the text. And it is here that we learn of the scavenger's daughter. Nobody knows this instrument, whether this instrument was actually named after the scavenger. Other sources allude to it as the stork, prompting its shape. Squeezed into a submissive posture, the victim was crazed by relentless muscle cramps. In the Tower, that would be the Tower of London, it ranked as the severest method of torture. It was especially reserved for the gravest of charges known to secular law, high treason. A well-known victim was Guy Fawkes, who had tried to blow up Parliament in 1605. Even today, England still has its Guy Fawkes Day, when the people celebrate his execution by burning his effigy. Let's take a look at the scavenger's daughter once again. Boutique lighting, colorization enhance the aura of the scavenger's daughter. But this illustration gives us an idea of how the stork would be placed in this painful position for prolonged periods of time. Stress and duress. And these unfortunate souls in this frame are also being storked, the scavenger's daughter. The stake. Burning at the stake, burning alive, is rife with theological significance from the standpoint of demonology. The act of faith is the term the Spanish Inquisition employed to refer to the execution of heretics and witches on the stake. By means of a bell chiming and a prayer of thanks, the church would show its victory over the demonic power. The more merrily the poor sinner would accept his physical death by fire, the greater the odds that his soul would escape eternal hellfire. Traditionally, fire is a symbol of purity. The stake was a special penal instrument for crimes that affected the entire community. In a moral and physical sense, the Inquisition believed that the purging power of the fire could save the corrupted world. So, burning at the stake is just not a ritual aimed at the individual. Rather, it is a much more communal ritual of punishment, and through fire provides a cleansing effect, ridding the community and this tainted individual of a larger threat of pollution. And coupled with the theory of the body, we begin to understand how a constellation of punishment and torture incorporates various paradigms of thought. Pollution, fire, demonology. That concludes this segment, and we've got more to come.